the Floyd's family is going through right now should never happen in the United States of America.
We each have to search our hearts, each and every one of us. Remove the hate and racism, the fruit will die.
One thing we done right was the day we decided to fight. So keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, my lordy, hold on. Hold on, my lordy, hold on.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining us. Recent incidents around the country have pushed the issue of racism to the forefront of conversations around the world and here in Acadiana. That dialogue includes police brutality, which has resulted in the deaths of multiple Black Americans. That has since led to rallies and peaceful protests demanding justice and police reform.
Here in Lafayette, demonstrations have been peaceful, but residents are still demanding change. Today, we are joined with a public official and members of the community to have a candid conversation about race relations and how to make our community a better place.
Joining us for this conversation is Herb Pucci, that's how we know him, Green, a local musician, educator, and as well as a counselor. Now, Dr. Tanisha Mallory, the Executive Director of Strategic Initiatives, and she is Chief of Diversity Officer at UL Lafayette.
And we are joined with Sheriff Mark Garber with the Lafayette Parish Sheriff's Office.
Now, we do want to share this note. We invited Mayor President Josh Guillory to be a part of this conversation, and he confirmed that he would come over a week ago.
However, about 48 hours before we taped this special, he decided to back out, citing time constraints. But we do want to thank everyone else for being here today, and we will begin the conversation with the biggest issue plaguing our communities right now, and that's policing. So we're going to start with Sheriff Mark Garber. In your swearing-in ceremony in June, you mentioned that the trust of the public has been broken by the actions of a few, and you talked about how you want to meet the expectations of the community. Our question is, what do you think those expectations are, and how do you plan on moving forward?
Well, it's a great question. What I've been saying for years, whether it's to my agency or to the UL students that I teach criminal justice to, is that policing has got to keep up with the demands of society. We serve the societies that we live in. And so as a culture, policing in some areas of the country, especially more than others, has failed to move forward and meet the expectations, the changing expectations. I think it's fair to say that there's never been more scrutiny on law enforcement, yet in some of the larger cities where we've had the most apparent problems, I believe it's due to a failure of the police culture there and the leadership culture to change with the times and with the expectations of the public. You know, you look at Ferguson, and I would have thought, maybe naively, that something, you know, like that, a systemic, what was documented by the Department of Justice in a well-documented report, systemic practices by police that were targeting minorities happened in a suburb of a major metropolitan area. We didn't learn our lesson going forward as a country, and subsequently you have these incidents that have come to light. Minneapolis, for example, and what I told my staff and those closest to me is, you know, absolutely as a peace officer, very shocked and very saddened. And those words aren't even adequate, because I really would not have believed that in modern day America, in a major metropolitan area, that this would occur. And, you know, that certainly, you know, it indicates that we as leaders in law enforcement need to change the culture of these agencies, because it's about culture and it's about empowering that leadership to enact the changes that they see fit. And when you have, you know, protections that lie in civil service and in unions, for example, as opposed to agencies that are at will employees like mine, I think that these chiefs, to be fair to them, are not very empowered to make changes. You know, the promotional systems often work on who the next most senior person is. They have little or nothing to do with merit in civil service systems. So I don't really blame these chiefs, but what I would like to see happen, instead of defunding the police, instead of you know, taking away qualified immunity, for example, and I spoke at length with Representative Jordan about his bill before he brought it to committee, and ultimately it didn't get out of committee. But you know, Representative Jordan and I have a much more common ground than you might think, and we both agree that changes need to be made. I disagree with him on taking that route, because you punish the good with the bad. Let's empower our police leadership to control their agencies and to do what's right, and then let's hold them accountable.
And speaking of controlling, so what happens, and looking at these changes, what happens when an officer gets accused of misconduct? Obviously investigations open up pretty much immediately on the part of law enforcement. And what happens to that officer typically during an investigation?
Well, it depends on the agency, Darla. That's kind of the problem. You know, you have cultures in some of the larger cities that have had problems where problem officers are ignored, or if they're not ignored by their chain of command, they're protected by their unions, they're protected by civil service rules. I've heard stories here locally from local chiefs about horrendous misconduct, and without naming any names, right, officers who are allowed to stay on the force.
Or get rehired.
Or in one case, they don't say anything and there's no record, and then I'll hire them, and I find out later that there were all sorts of problems, and they didn't say anything about it because they were protecting their agency at the time. You know, I've taken a different approach as a leader. I've held everyone accountable for their misconduct. I've arrested several deputies through my tenure, and you know, it's just a choice on firing someone versus bringing charges against them. A lot of chiefs and sheriffs don't want to do it. They don't want to face the ugly reality, but police, sheriff's deputies, constables are human beings. We're going to have good days and bad days. You're going to have your good apples and your bad apples. And if we don't start talking about it in honest terms, then we will never regain the trust of the public. We have to acknowledge that we all have implicit biases. Whether you're a police officer or whether you're a citizen, we all grow up with implicit biases. The science of bias that was you know, we brought in that training at the sheriff's office teaches us that, and it's real because we're human beings. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think part of the reason we got to where we are is because we've not wanted to talk about it. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity here today.
Does that speak to the perception of African American males? Because I knew she was shaking her head in agreement while you were speaking, Dr. Mallory.
Yeah, as you were speaking, Sheriff, I was thinking about the interactions that I've had with our students on campus, which I'm sure you've had many similar interactions, and we've hosted a number of conversations with our students. And after these nationally prominent events like Ferguson, like Alton Sterling and Baton Rouge, and like all the recent events that we've currently been talking about, we've pulled together students, and what we try to do is have cross-cultural learning. So we'll have young black men in the room with young white women, and we'll have international students who talk about, you know, the challenges that they face being in the United States. And what's been really powerful is to hear the impact of the constant, you know, interactions with police and the constant injustices when, you know, people are not held accountable for their actions. And that has a real impact on our community and how, you know, black men in particular and black women internalize those messages in a way that changes who they are, so changes how they interact in the community.
Right, so is it fair to say what people think, we're talking about their perceptions, black males are typically perceived as threatening.
Right.
And black folks will say all white people are racist. It's all of those generalizations where we just group everyone together. Not fair.
Right, and they're often misleading, right? Like, can we speak about how these stereotypes are often misleading and group people together, you know, as a whole?
Anyone?
I think as far as policing is concerned, I think that there's a big deficit in training. And what I mean by that is that police forces, well, law enforcement, you know, in particular, spend a lot of time on tactical, you know, procedures on how to combat that hostile citizen or whatever. But not enough training, you know, goes into understanding the makeup of different communities, the Latino community, the black community, or whatever. There are different cultures, but we all come together to live in this municipality. But if your perception of me as a black man is one that I'm hostile or I'm out to rob you or take what you have, then you haven't spent enough time trying to understand who I am as a person, let alone black people as a whole. So, you know, in responding to what Jala just said, we get grouped into a situation, and we know that that officer hadn't spent enough time understanding, because it takes you longer to become a barber than it does to become a police officer. And that just in and of itself, it shows that the training is just not there.
And
so
that's what Sheriff Garber was speaking to about that training that is so needed, especially when vetting new employees.
Well, I'd like to speak to that, because I think what you have an honest intention here, but I respectfully disagree with your contention that it's a training thing. We don't have to train people to be compassionate to fellow human beings.
Okay.
You know, no amount of training is going to train someone to be a good person, to know what's right and wrong. They know what's right and wrong. It's the culture of an agency, it's first line supervision, it is the chief of police and the command staff that actually sets the tone for an agency. When you have problems at an agency, it is a failure of leadership. Now, if we needed more training, I would be the first to say we need more training, but we are well trained. You're talking about a 9.5-month minimum process to go through this pipeline of training, and hours upon hours of annual recertification for in-service training in order to be a certified peace officer. It costs a lot to train and maintain peace officers. So when I hear the first solution being, well, we need more training from these legislators and different things, I cringe and I think, oh no, that's really what they think. They honestly believe this, but it is a failure in leadership. When Ferguson happens, it's a failure in leadership from the civilian authorities and the police authorities. When Minneapolis happens, it is a failure in leadership. Those officers felt comfortable doing what they did. Does anyone disagree with that?
No.
They felt absolutely comfortable.
Right, that's right.
How in the world do we sit here and think that they felt comfortable that they were going to do this with impunity? Do you think it was their first time? No, it wasn't their first time. They felt comfortable because of a culture at that agency that they weren't touchable, that they were protected by their union and by civil service.
And we watched
That's
the
the
community
problem.
stand by.
Right,
There were
people.
bystanders, so what do they do?
Right, there were residents. I guess our next question is, how as a community, do we learn to step up as well? Because officers that were involved in that incident also didn't step up, but like Darla said, there were community members out that also didn't step up. How do we do better as a whole?
Well, thankfully, the community members were calling the officers out. They did video it.
Right.
At least they did that. I think in fairness to them, that's all they could do. I really wouldn't expect one of them to walk up and pull Derek Chauvin off of George Floyd. I expect another officer to do it.
Right.
And absolutely, it's ridiculous that didn't happen, but that goes back to culture and leadership.
But if Chauvin was the senior most officer on that site, and his training kicked in, his training is what we saw.
No,
I beg to differ. You know
I
what I'm saying?
respect your opinion.
You say no, but in some instance that was acceptable. You know what I'm saying? Or he felt comfortable doing it, knowing that there wouldn't have been any pushback from the authorities that govern him.
Yeah, well, the second part of that I agree with. There's no training that's ever been done, even though when I was in the Secret Service, they taught us to kneel on people's necks. Okay, the Secret Service, the United States Secret Service, that in fact the instructor demonstrated on me. That was something to hold someone down who was violently resisting. He put his forearm, then his knee on the back of my neck. And the challenge was to see if you could do a push-up, push yourself up off the ground with the instructor on that. Okay. That was not a good tactic. We know that. But that was to subdue a violently resisting person where other methods had failed. There is no training that has ever been conducted that would teach or kick in or somehow put Derek Chauvin on autopilot. So, our training by and large, across the nation is solid. I think there should be more implicit bias training, such as what we've instituted at my training academy, to have an honest conversation about implicit bias. But as far as the tactics, look, that's to save your life in an out-and-out fight. And we have to recertify people annually to make sure that they can do it, so they can save their own life to save their partner's life. The culture of an agency will either lead to the militarization and the misuse of those tools, or it will lead to the judicious and proper use of tactics and procedures. And look, I respect your opinions, and I'm just putting this out there for your submission and consideration, that we should take a look at the root causes of this, as opposed to saying, okay, the police brutality. Well, where did it come from? Let's look at how police are raised, from baby police to mature police, and what they learn along the way.
Now, in talking of changing culture in offices and departments, does that come in maybe in vetting officers differently and how they're hired initially?
Well, you would think so, and I think that most agencies do a very good job of vetting. Certainly to become a deputy sheriff at my agency, you have to not only pass an extensive written psychological, but also a one-on-one interview with a psychologist who prepares a report. You then are polygraphed by a very experienced polygrapher, which is an extensive process involving a pre-polygraph interview, and we find out things about people that you would never imagine. I mean, it's people, their grandchild comes and they know they're applying for a job, and we don't hire them. It's very awkward because we find out things that even their close family didn't know. Right. I think we have an effective process, but even in the sheriff's office, you have the human element that changes with time on the street, and that's why I keep going back to it's a leadership issue. It's a first line supervisor issue. If you have a supervisor or a leadership chain of command that is tolerating people, deputies speaking in a demeaning manner to citizens, that doesn't stop there. It creeps forward slowly but surely into physical mistreatment and ultimately into civil rights violations. So you've got to stop it while it's small by leadership and by a culture at an agency.
Sheriff Garber said you can't teach compassion. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Mallory. That is such a profound statement, because you can teach someone how to love from I'm talking the home and that sort of thing. But what we saw with George Floyd, he's speaking directly to that. Dr. Mallory, how do we rid ourselves of these, specifically of the stereotypes, the bias? Can you identify the bias and then tell us how do we get rid of it?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about bias is that it's deep-seated within every one of us, and it touches every aspect of our life. It's not just in policing, right? It's in our K through 12 system. It's in our higher education system. It's in the residential segregation that we see in our communities. And so thinking about how, in our homes, how we are helping to shape the perceptions of our children. I think a lot, I have two little kids. My son is almost 3 and my daughter just turned 1. So I'm very cognizant of the messages that they're receiving about themselves and about the world around them. So I think about even the cartoons that they watch, the commercials that are on TV, the messages that we tell about children, about their worth, about what's possible, about what they can become. I'm a mathematician with a PhD from a pretty prestigious university, and I like to share that because when someone says mathematician, I can pretty much guarantee that this face is not what you see when you close your eyes and you imagine what a mathematician should look like. And I think that's really the essence of bias. It's just this idea that we have pictures in our head about what people are supposed to be and what they're supposed to act like, just because of the color of their skin or what they're wearing or what we've encountered in the past, the messages that we've been told. And so it really does take a concerted effort, from birth, to start to think about the next generation and how we're reprogramming those messages and trying to influence that bias.
I mean, we've come a long way.
We have.
Certainly, but of course we're going to reference George Floyd a lot because it really brought things to the forefront. So how do we change that? What do we do?
Well, some of what we've done at the university, I touched on the fact that bias is everywhere. And systemic injustice is everywhere. We think about the race relations and the challenges that we're facing. A lot of that is due to the fact that, Black people have not had the same opportunities as their white counterparts for decades. And so that's not something that we can change overnight, but it's also not going to change with hearts and minds. It's going to take systemic shifts and total transformation in how we do our work. So one example is that at the university, we started to have conversations about how do we measure qualifications. We think about the hiring processes within our organizations, within our companies. We think about places where, Black people are not represented. We think about faculty ranks in higher education. Black faculty are not well represented across the country, not just at UL. But we're having some really interesting conversations about, what defines a faculty member. If we're stuck in that image of an older white man, which is the traditional image of professors, right? Then when our young, diverse, young faculty members who are excited to come into our communities, they're going to be at a disadvantage simply because of those biases. And so we're starting to reprogram and reframe our admissions processes to have bias training throughout that admissions process so that, we understand the impact of, the challenges that women and people of color face when they're being evaluated in these structures that are traditionally, keeping them out. And so it really does come to a question of how are you changing systems?
Absolutely.
Definitely. And I know you brought up a topic you sent in to us about where do you think it starts dismantling this systematic oppression. And I know you mentioned at home, but for those, who are older or people in my generation who want to change their perception that maybe that was passed down from their grandparents, how do you start maybe, in the age you are now?
Yeah. Well, I think one really important strategy that people shy away from is being uncomfortable enough to have conversations with people who are not like you. In the last few weeks or so, my work has been very busy, as you can imagine. And so I've had a number of conversations with people that I would not have expected to be very interested in this discussion. One of my friends, I won't say who it is, but one friend who is very much the complete opposite of who I am, I'll just put it that way, came to me with a very honest, very open, transparent question about, I don't understand this whole Black Lives Matter movement. Can you explain that to me? And because we had developed a sense of trust, we were able to have a very honest discussion about the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And, those are the types of discussions that we're afraid to have in public. We're afraid to have those really challenging discussions because, we think about the perceptions that people will have about us if we say one thing.
So what did you answer? Because that's what everyone wants to know.
Absolutely. So the sense of the movement, Black Lives Matter, is really about a greater movement. It's not a political organization. It's not about a group of people who are trying to, tear down policing, right? It's about this greater movement that speaks to the challenges that Black people have faced for decades and really is trying to amplify those challenges and really take it beyond this moment. This moment of policing at this point in time is just one example of the hundreds of examples of injustices. And so Black Lives Matter is all about, shining a light on the fact that, yes, in an ideal world, all lives do matter. But the fact is, Black lives are being disregarded in so many different ways. And so if we can shine a light on, there are so many disparities. There are health disparities with the pandemic. We've seen that very clearly. There are educational disparities. And all of these things become multiplied when they're compounded on top of one another. And so I think in this moment, the reason why it feels so powerful, I feel like it's a different time. I feel different. And I think it's because of that magnified effect of the pandemic, of George Floyd and the national unrest. All of it, the political climate, right? All of it is just kind of compounding one on top of another, and it really is providing a shift, I think, in the narrative. We see a lot more allies, a lot more non-Black people that are standing up for the Black Lives Matter movement and for these injustices, and I'm really inspired by that.
My father always said that first of all, he never filled out forms and identified his race. He would put an H because he said, I'm human. And I said, Dad, why do you do that? And he said, the issue of race and identifying people as a color, white or black, red, yellow, is for political exploitation. He told me that at a young age. I barely even knew what politics were at that time, but it is perception.
Because I started to deal with racism very early here in Acadiana. My first experience with racism was being slapped across the face by my first grade teacher at 6 years old. I didn't know, what I had did or, or whatever. So that particular experience built something in me. It didn't make me angry because I didn't know what angry was.
Right.
But it made me apprehensive about trusting. And it goes both ways. I've been violated as a kid, and my ancestors were violated, and here it is 50 years later. And a couple of months ago, there was another young black boy whose teacher put her foot on his neck, as a form of restraint. And this was a special needs child. And I just, we've been having these conversations, since Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Vernon Johns, and I had the pleasure to speak with Representative John Lewis. We've been having these conversations, but what's different about this time right now is that, like the doctor said, people aren't taking it anymore. It's not just black people not taking it anymore, but it's white people, it's Asian people, it's Hispanics, it's the collection of people who are involving themselves in the Black Lives Matter movement are speaking to this is the way that blacks have been treated in America has been unfair. It's time to stop pacifying things.
And it's time to start. It's time to start talking.
It's time to start talking.
But we will, because we will continue these conversations.
Yes, yes. Well, this is just one of many of the conversations that we hope to have here at KLFY. So if you'd like to send your questions, your comments, or topics you'd like to hear about next, you can send an email to getcandid@klfy.com. This is only the beginning, hopefully, of many more conversations to come.
We look forward to you joining us again.
Thank you.